Captain Daniel Oakes slammed his hand on the table and pointed directly at Elena Cruz. "Sit down, Sergeant. You are embarrassing yourself and this entire unit." The room went silent. Every senior officer stared. Every fellow Marine looked away. 480 lives were hours from walking into a kill box, and the one person who knew it was just ordered to shut up. If this story makes you angry, good. It should. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. The morning started like every other morning at Forward Operating Base Warhorse. The generators hummed. The desert air already carried the kind of dry heat that crept under your collar before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline. Dust clung to everything, to boots, to rifles, to the inside of your throat if you breathed too deep. Somewhere across the base, someone was running a maintenance check on a vehicle engine, and the sound rolled through the air like distant thunder that never arrived. Elena Cruz had been awake since 3 in the morning. That was not unusual for her. She had always been an early riser long before the Marine Corps made it mandatory. Her father used to say that the world belonged to the people who were already up when everyone else was still dreaming. He was a sniper. He had learned to love the dark hours, the quiet ones, the hours when your mind was sharpest and the noise of the world had not yet caught up with you. Elena had inherited that from him. Or maybe she had just never been able to sleep as deeply as other people. Either way, she had been in the communications shack since before first light, headset on, eyes fixed on the scrolling data across her screen, fingers moving with the kind of quiet intensity that only comes when you know you are onto something real. She had been tracking the same set of encrypted transmissions for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of patterns. 3 weeks of frequencies that shifted at irregular intervals, not randomly, but according to a logic she had slowly, painstakingly begun to understand. The shifts were too deliberate to be equipment malfunction. The timing was too consistent to be coincidence. Whoever was broadcasting on those frequencies was doing it with discipline, with coordination, with the kind of careful, patient structure that told Elena one thing above everything else. Someone was organizing something. She had run the data 6 times. She had mapped the transmission origins against topographical overlays. She had cross-referenced the signal's timing against known enemy movement patterns from the previous 4 months of operational logs. Every time the conclusion was the same. Cara Basin. Both ridgelines, staged positions, coordinated fire lanes. The transmissions weren't random chatter. They were command and control communications for forces that had been moving into position over a period of weeks. Whoever was running this operation was experienced, patient. They had planned for the convoy. They had planned for the timeline. They had planned, almost certainly, for exactly the kind of intelligence failure that would put 480 Marines in the bottom of that basin without any idea what was waiting for them above. Elena pulled the headset off her ears and sat back in her chair. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. But inside her chest, something was pulling tight, the way a wire pulls tight when too much tension is applied to it, not yet breaking, but close, very close. She gathered her data. She organized it into a clear sequential briefing format, the way her father had taught her to present information, lead with the conclusion, then prove it. Don't bury the finding at the end. Don't make people work to get there. Give them the danger first, then explain why you're right. She printed the report. She folded it under her arm, and she walked to the battalion briefing. The room was already full when she arrived. Senior officers occupied the chairs at the front. Captain Daniel Oakes stood at the head of the briefing table with the kind of posture that people practice upright, deliberate, projecting authority, the way a lamp projects light. He was not a bad officer, Elena had always thought. He was not cruel, not incompetent in the conventional sense. He simply had the particular confidence of a man who had never been badly wrong about something important. That kind of confidence, she had noticed, made people deaf to information that challenged it. Beside him stood the battalion intelligence officer, a lieutenant named Rourke. Rourke had the reputation of being sharp, analytical, reliable. He was respected in the way that people are respected when they have been right enough times to build a wall of credibility around themselves, a wall that unfortunately can become harder to breach than any enemy position. Elena took a seat near the back. The briefing moved forward. Maps, convoy routes, timing windows, logistics breakdowns. The language was professional, calm, confident. The convoy would move through Cara Basin at 0700 the following morning. The road had been assessed. Intelligence had surveilled the area within the past 48 hours and found no significant threat indicators. Elena waited until there was a breath in the presentation. Then she stood up. "Captain Oakes, sir, I need to present something before this convoy route is finalized." Oakes looked at her. There was a brief pause, the kind that is not really a pause at all, but a small, automatic calculation. He didn't know her well. She was a communications sergeant, not intelligence, not operations, not one of the voices that normally spoke in this room. "Sergeant Cruz, this is a command briefing." "Yes, sir, I understand. What I have is directly relevant to the convoy safety." Another pause, shorter. He nodded once. 30 seconds, Sergeant." She moved to the front of the room. She placed her report on the table. She did not look down at it because she did not need to. "I have been monitoring a specific set of encrypted transmissions for 22 days, she said. "The signal patterns indicate staged enemy positioning along both ridgelines of Kara Basin. The timing and frequency of the transmissions are consistent with coordinated command and control communication. Based on the data, I believe the convoy is being directed into a prepared ambush." The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Lieutenant Rourke spoke. "Sergeant, our intelligence surveillance covered the Kara Basin area 48 hours ago. No hostile activity was detected. With respect, sir, ground surveillance wouldn't necessarily capture encrypted radio coordination from entrenched positions. The signals I've been tracking suggest forces that have been staging gradually over several weeks. They would be dug in." "You're a communications sergeant," someone said from the left side of the table. The voice was flat, not hostile yet, just the tone of a man who had already decided where this conversation was going. "Yes, sir. Your specialty is signal intercept and relay, not threat analysis." "I'm aware of my specialty, sir, but the patterns in the data are clear enough that—" "Sergeant," Oak's voice cut across the room with a precision that silenced everything else. "The intelligence assessment for Kara Basin has been completed by the appropriate personnel. What you're describing is a pattern of signals that could have multiple explanations. We don't reroute convoy operations based on a communications sergeant's personal interpretation of intercept data." Elena felt a shift in the room, not hostile, something almost worse. The quiet collective settling of a group of people who had already agreed on an outcome before she had spoken. The polite dismissal that was worse than anger because it left no room to fight back. She kept her voice even. "Sir, if I'm wrong, the cost is a delayed convoy and a revised route. If I'm right—" "You're not right, Sergeant." Rourke's voice was crisp, professional, final. "Our analysis does not support your reading of those transmissions. The frequency patterns you're describing are consistent with low-level insurgent communication traffic we've documented throughout the region. There is no indication of the coordinated staging you're claiming." "Then let me show you the mapping data." "Sergeant Cruz." Oakes's voice again, and this time there was something in it that had not been there before. Not quite anger, something colder than anger. Certainty. "Return to your post." She stood there for one more second. 1 second in which every face in that room either looked away from her or looked at her with the careful blankness of people who did not want to take a side. She looked at Staff Sergeant Marcus Vega. He was seated near the middle of the room, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He had known Elena for 8 months. They had worked together on 3 different operations. He was a good soldier, a fair man, someone she had, in the quiet way you develop opinions about people in a place like this, trusted. He looked at the table. Elena picked up her report. She walked back to her seat. She gathered her materials with slow, deliberate movements. And then she left the room. Outside, the desert heat hit her immediately. She stood still for a moment with the folded report in her hands. She could hear the briefing continuing inside, the calm, professional voices moving on to the next item on the agenda as if she had never spoken at all. 480 Marines. The number moved through her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that wouldn't stop. She went back to the communications shack. She sat down. She put the headset back on, and for a long time she just listened to the transmissions, steady and patient and deliberate, exactly as they had been for 22 days. The same patterns, the same timing, the same unmistakable logic of preparation. She ran the data a 7th time. The conclusion did not change. She spent the next 4 hours writing escalation requests, one to Rourke's direct superior, one through the alternate intelligence channel, one flagged as urgent through the battalion communications log. Each one contained the full data set, the map transmission origins, the timeline analysis, the frequency pattern, documentation. Each one was written in the precise, unambiguous language her father had taught her to use when the situation required no room for misinterpretation. The first response came back in 40 minutes. Acknowledged, under review. No action at this time. The second came back in 2 hours. Data reviewed. Does not meet threshold for rote modification. The third was not responded to at all. Elena sat with the silence of that for a long time. She thought about her father. Not the version of him that existed in photographs or in the formal military stories she had grown up hearing. She thought about the real version. The version that sat across from her at the kitchen table when she was 12 years old and said something she had never forgotten. He had been cleaning his rifle the way he always did on Sunday evenings, systematic and unhurried, and she had asked him what it felt like to be responsible for people's lives. He had set down the cleaning rod. He had looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness that was the thing she remembered most about him. Not his size, not his voice, but that steadiness, the sense that the ground under his feet was always solid no matter what was happening around him. It feels like the most serious thing in the world, he said, and the only wrong answer is to walk away when you know what you know. She had been 12. She had nodded and not fully understood. She understood now. Elena closed the communications logs. She sat very still for several minutes. Then she opened the operational maps on her screen and studied the ridge overlooking Cara Basin. The North Ridge, high ground, clear sight lines across both valley floors and both opposing ridge lines. The kind of position a sniper would choose. The kind of position her father had taught her to identify before she could drive a car. She spent the next hour and a half moving through a sequence of actions that felt, even as she was performing them, like the point of no return. She was not frantic. She was not reckless. She was calm in a way that was deeper than the usual kind of calm, the calm that comes on the other side of a decision that has already been fully made when there is nothing left to deliberate. She accessed the armory during the shift change. The window was narrow. She knew the schedule, had always known it without particularly trying, to the way you absorb the rhythms of a place you live in. The M40A5 was in the secondary weapons rack, a sniper rifle she had qualified on 6 months earlier during a training rotation, a qualification that no one in the battalion briefing had thought to mention, because why would they? She was a communications sergeant. She took it. She took the ammunition she needed. She took water in her field kit, and then she walked off the base, through the perimeter wire into the dark desert, alone. The night air was different from the daytime heat, thin and cold in the way that desert nights always are, carrying sounds farther than they should travel and making the stars look closer than science says they are. She moved at a pace that was fast without being careless. She had memorized the terrain from the maps, but she read the ground as she moved, adjusting, noting, trusting the training that lived in her muscles more than in her conscious mind. She thought about those Marines who were sleeping right now, who would wake up tomorrow and eat breakfast and climb into their vehicles and drive north toward Cara Basin, confident in the intelligence assessment, carrying the weight of their gear and their weapons and the professional trust they placed in the people who were supposed to know what was waiting for them. She thought about Vega, sitting at that table with his hands folded, looking away. She did not allow herself to be angry about it. Anger was a luxury she could not afford tonight. She needed everything she had for what was ahead. The ridge was 11 kilometers from the base. She covered the distance in just under 3 hours, moving through terrain that required full attention, choosing her footing with the care that darkness demanded. When she reached the high ground and found the position she had identified from the maps, she stopped. She set up with the precision of someone who had been doing this since long before it was part of her official duties. Her father had started her young, prone position, stabilized, field of fire covering the basin floor in both opposing ridge lines. She checked her watch. 0347. The convoy was scheduled to enter the basin at 0700. She had 3 hours and 13 minutes. She lay still in the dark and listened to the desert. And somewhere below her on the ridgelines, she could not yet see clearly, in the pre-dawn black, she could hear faintly, carefully, the way you hear something that is trying very hard not to be heard, movement. Not wind, not wildlife, people. Her jaw tightened. She set her breathing to the slow, steady rhythm her father had drilled into her over 100 dry practice sessions in the backyard of their house in San Diego, the rhythm that separated the ordinary heartbeat from the combat heartbeat, the rhythm that made the difference between a shot that mattered and a shot that didn't. She had been right. The thought did not feel like vindication. It felt like weight. Because being right meant 480 people were about to drive into the mouth of this. And the only thing standing between them and what was waiting on those ridge lines was one woman, one rifle, and everything her father had ever taught her. She settled in. She waited. And the dark hours moved forward with the slow, inevitable patience of something that cannot be stopped, only survived. The first light came the way it always does in the desert, not gently, not gradually, but with a kind of sudden authority, as if the darkness had simply decided it was done. One moment the basin below was a black shape against a black sky. The next outlines began to separate themselves from shadow. Ridge from sky, rock from ground, distance from depth. Elena had not slept. She had not expected to sleep. Sleep was not a possibility she had even considered when she settled into position 3 hours earlier. What she had done instead was something closer to the state her father used to describe as combat stillness. Not rest, not alertness in the twitchy, anxious sense, but a kind of deep-rooted focus where the body conserved everything it didn't need and the mind stayed perfectly, quietly tuned to the world around it. Her water was beside her right hand. She had drunk half of it during the night in small, measured sips. Her rifle was stable. Her field kit was open and organized in the exact sequence she would need if things moved fast. She checked her watch. 05:22, 1 hour and 38 minutes until the convoy entered the basin. Below her in the pre-dawn gray, the basin floor was still, but the ridgeline across from her was not as still as it appeared. She had been tracking the movement over there for the past 2 hours the way a particular shadow shifted. 40 minutes ago, the way a shape that had not been there at midnight was now clearly there at 0400 low against the rock and not moving the practiced stillness of someone trained to be invisible. They were good. She had to give them that. If she had not been lying here for 3 hours with nothing to do but watch, she might have missed them entirely. She counted positions as the light improved. 2 confirmed on the far ridge, possibly a third slightly north. On her own side, lower down the slope, she had heard movement twice. Careful, disciplined movement, people who knew how to move without announcing themselves. The ambush was fully staged. The thought landed in her chest like a stone. Not because it surprised her, she had known this was coming, had known it for 22 days of data and 6 hours of sleepless watching, but because knowing something and seeing it take physical shape in front of you are 2 entirely different experiences. The knowing had been professional. The seeing was personal. 480 people. She pressed her cheek against the stock of the rifle and ran the ranging calculations in her mind. The distances were long but not impossible. Her father had taught her to work at distance. He had a saying that she used to roll her eyes at when she was younger, and now understood completely: a shot you don't take from 1,000 meters is a shot that kills someone at 10. The distance was not a disadvantage. The distance was the point. At 0550, something changed. She heard it before she could identify it, a shift in the quality of the silence, the way silence changes when more people are present in it. Down on the far ridge, there was communication happening. Short bursts, hand signals she could not see from her angle, but the behavioral patterns were clear. People confirming, positions checking, readiness, the final coordination before an action begins. They knew the convoy was coming. Of course they knew. They had known for weeks. That was what her data had been showing her, and what everyone with the authority to act on it had refused to see. The intelligence failure was not a mistake of competence. It was a mistake of arrogance. The particular arrogance of people who trust their own previous conclusions more than new information that challenges them. She thought about the briefing room, about Captain Oak's voice cutting across her words with that flat, final certainty, about Rourke's professional dismissal, about Vega's eyes on the table. She pushed it down, all of it. There was no room for it here. At 0615, she heard the first distant engine sounds. Not the convoy, too early, too faint. Pre-positioning vehicles, maybe, or the lead elements of an enemy exfil plan staged behind the ridgelines in case things went wrong for them. She logged the direction and approximate distance in her mind and filed it. Everything was data. Everything mattered. She adjusted her breathing, in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the heartbeat slowing and evening out the way her father had shown her in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon when she was 14, with a paper target pinned to a plywood board, and the whole rest of the world seeming entirely unreal compared to the small, precise world inside the scope. The trigger doesn't break the shot, he had told her. The breath does. The trigger is just the last thing that happens. 0640, 20 minutes. The engine sounds to the south changed. Closer, more of them. The kind of rolling mechanical sound that belongs to a convoy of vehicles moving in formation, heavy and deliberate. Elena felt her pulse tick up 2 beats and brought it back down deliberately. Her hands were steady. Her eye was steady. Everything inside her was pulled to a single unbreakable point of focus. She heard a voice below and to her left, not close 40 meters maybe, but the desert morning was quiet enough to carry it. A single word in a language she partially understood from her signals work. A confirmation, an acknowledgement. Someone down there had just been told it was time. The convoy was entering the basin. She could hear it now clearly. The engines, the weight of the vehicles on the road surface, the way the sound bounced off the rock walls of the basin and came back slightly distorted, slightly multiplied. She tracked it without moving. She knew the road layout from the maps. She knew exactly where the lead vehicles would be when the kill zone activated. She had 2 choices, and she had been cycling between them for the past hour. Not because she was uncertain, but because she needed to be absolutely sure she had considered every consequence of both. She could reveal herself now, fire a warning shot, alert the convoy. But warning shots at this distance, at this hour, in an active staging environment, would accomplish one thing above everything else. They would tell the ambush that their cover was blown, and they would likely trigger the attack immediately before the convoy was fully in the basin. But while it was still partially in it and completely unable to maneuver or retreat in time. Or she could wait, let the convoy enter, let the ambush reveal its positions when it opened fire, and then work. She knew which choice her father would have made. She knew because he had told her in that same quiet backyard voice the rule that governed every high-value shot decision: you don't shoot to signal, you shoot to solve. She waited. At 0658, the first vehicle cleared the northern entrance of the basin. At 0704 seconds, everything exploded. The sound was enormous. Not the Hollywood version of battle sounds, not clean, separate explosions with silence between them, but a wall of overlapping noise that hit the morning air and shattered it entirely. RPGs, machine guns, the deep rhythmic hammering of heavy caliber weapons that had been dug in and positioned and zeroed in on that road for weeks. The convoy's lead vehicles were hit within the first 3 seconds, and the burning wreckage immediately choked the forward movement of everything behind them. Elena was already working. She had the first machine gun position on the far ridge in her scope before the second RPG fired. She had identified it during the night, the shape of the emplacement, the slight disturbed earth around it. That thermal difference in the pre-dawn air had made visible to her patient, careful watching. She exhaled. The trigger was the last thing that happened. The machine gun position went silent. She was already moving to the second. The basin below was chaos: vehicles, burning men scrambling for cover behind wheel wells and road embankments, the enormous disorienting noise of an ambush that had been prepared by professionals who knew exactly how to make the first 60 seconds as overwhelming as possible. The psychological effect of a well-prepared ambush is not just the physical destruction, it is the paralysis. The few seconds where trained soldiers become simply people trying to survive the incomprehensible. Elena did not give the ambush its 60 seconds. She found the second machine gun position north end of the far ridge, slightly elevated, covering the rear vehicles. She exhaled. She worked. The second position went silent. Down in the basin, she could see small at this distance, but real men beginning to move differently. The paralysis was cracking. Not because the danger had passed, it had not. There were still RPG teams and mortar positions, and at least 3 other crew-served weapons she had identified and not yet addressed, but because 2 of the most dominant fire sources had been removed without those men on the ground having any understanding of how or from where. They were starting to think again, and thinking was the first step toward surviving. She moved to the RPG team on the near ridge below, and to her right, partially concealed but visible from her elevation. They were preparing a second shot at a vehicle that still had people alive inside it. She exhaled. Third shot. Third silence. The mortar position was harder. It was farther north along the far ridge, dug into a prepared position with overhead cover on three sides. She could see the crew working it, the rhythm of loading and firing, the disciplined repetition of people who had practiced this exact sequence many times. Mortars were killing Marines on the valley floor in a pattern that was walking systematically toward the largest cluster of survivors. She took an extra 2 seconds on the ranging calculation. Her father's voice, "If you rush the long shot, you guarantee the miss, and you guarantee the death that follows it." She did not rush it. Fourth shot. The mortar crew lost its operator. The weapon went silent mid-sequence. It was at this point, approximately 90 seconds into the ambush, that something happened that she had not fully planned for, though some part of her had known it was possible. The far ridge went quiet for a count of 5. Then there was shouting. Not in the valley on the ridge. The enemy forces up there had just experienced 4 of their key positions going silent in 90 seconds, from an origin they could not identify, could not locate, and could not understand. The psychological impact of that was its own force multiplier, separate from the physical reduction of their firepower. But one of them was smart enough or experienced enough to work backward. She heard the shout, a single word repeated, urgent. She did not need to fully understand the language. The tone told her everything. Someone had just told them where to look. Her ridge. The dynamic of the battle shifted in that moment. Below in the basin, the survivors were using the gaps she had created to begin moving, regrouping, finding each other in the chaos and doing the thing that good soldiers do. When you give them even a fraction of an opening, they started fighting back. She could see a cluster of them behind a burning vehicle, and one figure among them was moving with a distinct, organized urgency that suggested someone had stopped being a casualty and started being a leader. She didn't have time to identify who it was, because above her on the slope behind her position, she heard the first footsteps. They were coming up the ridge. She made the calculation instantly. The kind of calculation that happens in the body, rather than the mind, that operates in the space between awareness and action where training lives. She could move, relocate. But relocation meant taking her eye off the basin floor, meant the people down there losing their protection exactly at the moment they were beginning to use it. She stayed. She turned just long enough to confirm what she had heard. 2 figures, maybe 3, moving up the slope below her position, using the terrain methodically. Not running. Moving like people who had done this before, who knew that a running man makes noise and a slow man arrives. She had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached her elevation. She turned back to the basin. There was still a heavy gun position on the far ridge's southern end that had not yet been addressed. She had been working north to south along the confirmed positions and had not reached it yet. It was the one currently pinning the largest group of survivors against the east embankment of the road, the one preventing them from moving north toward the only viable exit corridor. She exhaled. 5th shot, the heavy gun went silent. Below, the group behind the east embankment began to move. The figure she had noticed earlier, the one with the organized urgency, was directing them north with the kind of clear, decisive gesture that does not require words. Get up, move. Now, she watched for half a second, the professional part of her mind registering that whoever that was, they were good. They understood the gap she had just created, and they were using it before it closed. The footsteps behind her were closer now. She turned her body to address the threat from above, keeping one hand on the rifle, using every bit of the terrain around her position, the way her father had taught her. Not just the ground you're on, but the ground around you, the angles, the dead spaces, the places where a person moving towards you has to commit to a specific line of approach. The first figure crested a rock shelf 22 meters below her. She was already looking at him. He was not looking at her. That difference was everything. When the immediate threat above her was neutralized, she was back on the scope in under 4 seconds. The basin had changed. The battle was still fierce, still loud, still dangerous, but it had a different shape now. The initial overwhelming structure of the ambush had broken into something less coordinated. The loss of command positions, of crew-served weapons, of the methodical mortar fire, it had degraded the enemy's ability to maintain unified pressure. They were still fighting. But they were fighting a different battle than the one they had planned. And down in the valley, the Marines were still fighting too. She identified a spotter position on the far ridge, someone with a radio, someone who was trying to reassemble the fire coordination that had been collapsing for the past several minutes. A spotter with a radio could rebuild what she had been taking apart. She understood that with complete clarity. She exhaled. Sixth shot, the radio went silent. There was a sound behind her. Rocks displaced a scrape of boot on stone. A second figure had made it higher than the first. She spun. In the seconds that followed, she did things that she would not be able to fully reconstruct in sequence afterward, because the sequence became less important than the outcome. Her training did not fail her. Her father's voice was somewhere in all of it, steady, certain, the voice of a man who had been in places exactly like this and had come back to sit at a kitchen table and teach his daughter what he had learned. When it was over, she was breathing hard for the first time. She lay still for 3 full seconds, listening, checking, making absolutely certain she understood the current state of the ground around her before she moved her attention anywhere else. Then she turned back to the basin. The battle was still happening. It was going to keep happening. There were still positions she had not addressed, still threats she needed to find and eliminate before the survivors below could complete their movement north. She had not saved anyone yet. Not fully, not finally. She had bought seconds and seconds and minutes were what people needed to become survivors instead of casualties. But the account was still open and the balance was still uncertain. She found the next position. She exhaled. She worked. Down in the valley, the man she had been watching, the one with the organized urgency, the one who had started moving people north. The moment she cleared, the heavy gun was fully in motion, now pulling people with him, directing fire from the survivors toward the remaining active positions with a tactical coherence that told her he had been in something like this before and had not let it break him. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it later. His name was Marcus Vega, the same man who had sat at a briefing table with his hands folded and looked at the table when she needed someone to speak. He was making a different choice now. And she was making hers. The morning was fully lit. The desert sun was climbing. The sounds in the basin were still enormous, still chaotic, still violent, but the shape of it had changed in a way that mattered. The ambush was losing its architecture. The carefully planned, methodically staged kill box was becoming something messier, something less certain, something that the people at the bottom of it might actually survive. Elena Cruz pressed her cheek against the stock of the rifle. She exhaled. She kept working. The battle had been running for 11 minutes. Elena knew this because she had checked her watch at 0704 seconds when the first RPG fired, and she had not stopped counting since. 11 minutes felt like 11 hours from inside it, she suspected, from down in the basin where the noise was total and the fire was coming from multiple directions and the ground itself seemed to be trying to kill you. From up here on the ridge where she had the distance and the elevation and the terrible clarity that comes with both, 11 minutes felt like 11 seconds. Like something that had started before she was fully ready and was moving faster than anything she had planned for. She had taken 11 shots. 9 of them had landed on confirmed positions. 2 had been directed at the figures climbing toward her from the slope below, and both of those situations had been resolved in the way that needed resolving, though she refused to think about that in any terms beyond the purely operational for now. There was no room for anything else. She had 7 rounds remaining in the current magazine, 2 additional magazines in her field kit. She was doing math constantly. Not just the ranging math, the drop and wind compensation and timing math of long-distance shooting, she was doing tactical math. How many positions remained active? How many she could address before the next set of threats reached her elevation? How many seconds each gap she created would stay open before the enemy adapted? How many of those seconds Vega and his people could use before the next position closed down on them? It was the most complex equation she had ever run. And it was running continuously without pause in the back of her mind, while the front of her mind stayed locked on the scope. At 0716, she found the mortar crew's replacement. Someone down there was smart. When she had taken out the primary mortar position 9 minutes ago, they had not simply accepted the loss. They had moved a secondary crew to a different position farther north along the ridge, more protected, the angle less clean from her elevation. It had taken them 9 minutes to get it operational, and in those 9 minutes, the survivors in the basin had made meaningful progress north. But now the mortars were back. The first round from the new position landed 30 meters east of the largest moving cluster of survivors. The second would be adjusted. The third would be on target. That was how mortars worked. The first round told you where you were, and everything after that was just arithmetic. She did not have the angle she wanted. The new position had been chosen well with overhead cover that blocked her clean line from directly above. She needed to shift her own position not much 6 meters to her right and slightly lower on the slope. But those 6 meters meant movement, and movement meant sound, and there were still people below who were looking for her. She moved anyway. 6 meters. Deliberate, low. She covered it in 12 seconds and settled back into prone, reacquiring the new mortar position through the scope. The crew was loading the second round. She exhaled. The shot was not clean. It was the hardest one she had taken. The angle partially obstructed the targeting, requiring her to thread a gap in the overhead cover that was barely wider than the margin of error she was working with. Her father's voice was very clear in her head for this one. Not a specific instruction, just the tone, the steadiness, the absolute refusal to hurry what could not be hurried without destroying it. The second mortar round never fired. She was back on the scan, immediately sweeping the far ridge for the next active position, because the moment she stopped scanning was the moment something she hadn't identified yet decided the outcome for her. Down in the basin, Vega had the survivors moving in a column formation along the east side of the road, using the burning vehicles as partial cover, pushing north with the kind of urgent, organized discipline that she had been watching build over the past several minutes. He was good at this, at reading the gaps she was creating and moving people through them before they closed. She didn't know if he understood what was happening, if he had any idea there was a shooter on the ridge above, or if he simply thought his tactical situation was randomly improving. It didn't matter. He was using it. That was what mattered. A voice crackled in the valley below. She could not hear the words at this distance, but she could hear the register and urgency. An officer calling for something, air support probably. Every ground commander in a situation like this called for air support first. She knew the response to that call before anyone gave it air support was minimum 40 minutes away, likely more. The base was too far, the response chain too long, the approval process too layered. They were on their own for another 30 minutes at least. 30 minutes was forever. She found an RPG team repositioning on the near ridge they had moved since she last addressed that area, pulling back to a secondary position that gave them a new angle on the column Vega was leading. They were setting up for a shot at the lead group, but one most exposed during the movement north. She shifted the scope. The RPG team had 2 people. One was loading, one was steadying. They were going to fire in approximately 8 seconds. She exhaled. The shooter went down with the weapon. The second man dropped the round he was carrying and pulled back behind cover. 7 seconds. The column kept moving. She checked her watch. 07:23. 19 minutes into the ambush. The battle had a different texture now than it had had at the beginning. The opening of an ambush has a specific quality overwhelming, unified the sense that the attacking force is a single massive thing bearing down on you from every direction simultaneously. What she had been doing for the past 19 minutes was systematically dismantling that unity. Each crew-served weapon she took out was one less coordinated node in the network. Each spotter she removed was one less set of eyes correcting fire and directing resources. The ambush was still dangerous, enormously, lethally dangerous, but it was becoming less coherent, less structured, more like individual fighters making individual decisions than a coordinated killing machine working to a plan. That change was the difference between a massacre and a battle. A massacre had a predetermined outcome. A battle could go either way. She was turning this from a massacre into a battle. The thought did not make her feel heroic. It made her feel exhausted and focused and slightly cold, the way high-stakes clarity always feels. Not triumphant, not proud, just intensely, completely present. At 07:26, she heard something new from the slope below and behind her. More movement. More than before. They had reorganized after losing the first 2 people on the slope, and now they were coming with more. She estimated 4, possibly 5, moving with more caution, this time using the available cover more systematically. Someone down there had learned from the first attempt. That was the problem with fighting competent people. They adapted. She had 3 choices. She could relocate again, but there was no position that gave her both full coverage of the basin and full protection from the slope. She could address the slope threat first and then return to the basin, but Vega's column was now in the most exposed section of the northern exit corridor, the section where two remaining positions on the far ridge had clean fire lanes and had been using them. Or she could stay on the base and work and accept that the people on the slope were going to reach her. The Marine Corps had a term for this kind of situation. They called it the tactical decision point, the moment where every option carries unacceptable cost, and you have to choose the one with the piece that you can most afford to pay. She stayed on the basin. The two remaining far ridge positions were working the north corridor methodically, and Vega's column was taking fire from both. She could see the column had broken into smaller elements behind cover, and the forward motion had stalled. The gap she had been creating and maintaining for 20 minutes was closing. If the column stalled here in this section of the corridor, they were pinned against terrain that offered no secondary options. The math of survival stopped working. She took the closer of the two positions first. Then she was already moving to the second working, quickly, not hurrying. There was a difference, and she knew the difference intimately, working through the calculation for the second position while her body was still settling from the first shot. The second position fell silent at 0731. Below Vega's column surged forward. She could see the movement restart with a kind of desperate, committed energy, people who had been pinned and were suddenly not pinned, using every second of the opening before it could close. And then from the valley floor there was a new sound. ASMAW rocket. The distinctive backblast of a shoulder-fired rocket that one of the survivors had brought to bear on a remaining heavy gun position that had been tearing through a section of the convoy near the south end. The rocket hit. The position went up with a sound that she could feel in her chest from 1,000 meters away. Someone down there had found a way to fight back. She didn't know who it was. She would find out later that the Marine who fired that shot was a 19-year-old Lance Corporal named Dawson, who had pulled the SMAW from a burning vehicle, loaded it under fire, and used it while two of his closest friends were lying wounded beside him. Dawson had never fired a SMAW in combat before. He had fired it exactly twice in training. The shot was not perfect, but it was enough. That was the moment the momentum shifted. Not completely, not safely, but fundamentally. The ambush had been designed to dominate from the first second to the last, to be so overwhelming in its opening that the trapped force never had the opportunity to organize any meaningful response. Elena had been disrupting that design for 27 minutes. Dawson's shot was the first active blow struck from below. The first moment when the Marines in the valley were not just surviving but fighting back in a way that cost the ambush something. The two forces were now in a real battle. At 0734, the most dangerous moment of the entire engagement arrived. She had been so focused on the far ridge and the repositioned mortar and the corridor positions that she had not given enough attention to the northern end of her own ridge, the section that curved around above the exit corridor. There was a position there. She had noted it during the night as a possible location, had flagged it in her mental map, but had not confirmed it as active because it had shown no fire in the first 30 minutes of the engagement. It activated at 0734. A machine gun heavy caliber dug in and positioned specifically to cover the northern exit, the exact corridor that Vega was now pushing 400 survivors through. The timing was not accidental. Whoever was commanding the ambush force had been watching the movement. North had seen his other positions being systematically removed and had held this one in reserve for exactly this moment. It was the second line, the fail-safe. The position that existed specifically to kill the people who survived everything else. It was also from her current position on the same ridge she was on, not the far ridge, her ridge. She was on the south section. The new position was on the north section, curved around and above her, at a distance that was close for a rifle engagement, 230 meters maybe, but separated by terrain that made a direct line of sight partial and complicated. She heard it open fire, and she understood immediately what it was and what it would do if it stayed operational for more than 90 seconds. The column was fully in the corridor. They had no cover from this angle. 90 seconds of fire from that position at this moment would undo 32 minutes of everything she had done. She was already moving. Not the careful, deliberate 6-meter shift she had done earlier. She was moving fast along the ridge, using the terrain as fast cover, staying low, covering ground with the focused urgency of someone who has done the math and knows exactly how many seconds they have. Her father's voice was not in her head during these 15 seconds. Nothing was in her head except the ground under her hands and feet, in the distance closing, and the sound of the machine gun working through the corridor below, and the number 90 counting down in her chest without words. She found her angle at 13 seconds. She did not have a perfect position. She was partially exposed on her left side, and the shooting angle was not what she would have chosen with more time. She accepted it completely and without negotiation. She exhaled. The machine gun went silent at 07:36. She lay absolutely still for 3 full seconds, breathing, listening, checking. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear she recognized, but from the physical demand of moving at that speed, and then going immediately to the stillness required for the shot. The body did not always cooperate smoothly with what the mind needed from it. She steadied. Below in the corridor, the column was still moving, still alive, still pushing north. At 0740, Vega's voice cut through the noise of the valley. She could not hear the words. She could not hear words from this distance, but she could hear the register of it, the tone of a man who was in command of himself even when everything around him was in chaos. She had heard that tone in her father's voice. She recognized it the way you recognize something that has always been part of your life. She swept the scope back to the far ridge. 3 positions were still showing activity, not crew-served weapons, not the coordinated fire of a functioning ambush, but individual fighters, people who had lost their coordination and were now operating on their own initiative, which was both less dangerous and harder to predict. Individual fighters made decisions that were not always rational. They did things that a coordinated plan would never sanction. She had to keep finding them, keep removing the ones that had angles on the corridor, keep maintaining the pressure that had kept the ambush from reassembling. She found the first of the 3. She worked. At 0748, she became aware that she was out of water. The half bottle she had brought was gone. She had not noticed drinking the second half. The body makes its demands without announcing them, and she had been answering those demands automatically without tracking them. The desert morning was fully heated now, the sun high enough to be doing its real work, and the physical demand of everything she had been doing for the past 44 minutes had burned through her reserves faster than she had planned for. She set the thought aside. Water was a problem for later. Later was a concept she was not certain she had earned yet. At 0752, she heard a radio transmission. Not enemy radio, her own radio, which she had set to the battalion frequency before she left the base, and had been running quietly in her field kit throughout the engagement. The voice on it was urgent, professional, and absolutely lost. It was Captain Oakes. She recognized his voice immediately. He was calling for air support with a desperate precision that told her he was not panicking. He was too well trained for panic, but he was operating in a situation that had completely exceeded his intelligence picture, and he was doing the only things he had left to do, which were calling for assets that were 40 minutes away and coordinating with survivors on the ground who could not tell him where the fire was coming from because it was coming from everywhere. She almost activated her radio. She had it in her hand for 2 seconds. Then she put it back. Not because that she did not want to talk to him, not because she wanted him to keep not knowing, but because activating a radio transmission from her current position would give her location to every enemy scanner within range, and her location was the one thing she needed them to not know. The moment they knew exactly where she was, they could direct enough resources at her position to end what she was doing. And what she was doing was the only thing keeping the corridor open. She set the radio back in the kit. She found the second of the 3 remaining far ridge positions. She exhaled. She worked. At 0856 minutes after the ambush began, the shape of the battle had changed to something that might, with effort and luck and continued work, become survivable. The exit corridor was not fully clear. There were still active threats. There were still Marines in the valley who had not yet reached the northern end. The air support that would finally eventually arrive was still more than 30 minutes away. But the ambush was no longer an ambush. It was a battle. And Elena Cruz, lying on a ridge with a stolen rifle and an empty water bottle, and the memory of her father's voice steady in the back of her mind, was still working. Below her, Staff Sergeant Marcus Vega was pushing the last elements of the column toward the exit, his voice carrying above the sound of everything clear and certain, and refusing absolutely to accept any other outcome than the one he was fighting for. He did not know she was there. None of them knew she was there. They knew only that something had happened on the ridge lines above them, that guns had gone silent at moments that saved lives, that fire that should have been overwhelming had been interrupted again and again by something they could not see or explain. Some of them would later describe it as luck. Some would describe it as something else, something they did not have a clean word for. Elena knew what it was. It was a decision made in a communication shack at 3 in the morning. It was 22 days of data that everyone with authority had refused to look at. It was a father's voice in a San Diego backyard teaching a 12-year-old girl to breathe before she pulled the trigger. She found the third far ridge position. She exhaled. She worked. And somewhere in the valley below, a 19-year-old Marine named Dawson was helping a wounded man to his feet, and Staff Sergeant Nate Vega was looking at the northern exit getting closer and saying through gritted teeth to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "Move, just keep moving. Somebody up there is covering us, and I don't know who, but I am not going to waste what they're giving us." He was right, and Elena Cruz kept giving it. Vega did not stop moving. That was the thing about him that the men around him would talk about later in the quiet debriefs and the louder conversations at tables where people spoke the truth more freely than they did in official reports. He did not stop moving, not once. Not when the RPG hit the vehicle 20 feet ahead of him and the shockwave knocked him sideways into the road embankment. Not when Corporal Hayes went down on his left and he had to make the split-second calculation that every soldier dreads, the one where you decide whether you stop for the one or you keep moving for the many. Not when the machine gun on the North Ridge opened up and the corridor that had looked like salvation suddenly looked like the last place on earth any sane person would choose to walk into. He kept moving. And because he kept moving, other people kept moving. It was 08:03, 59 minutes since the first RPG. The sun was fully established now, doing what the desert sun does without apology or restraint. And the men in the valley were carrying the combined weight of an hour of combat, the physical weight of gear and weapons, and the heavier, less quantifiable weight of an hour of fear held at arm's length through sheer will. Vega had 37 people with him in the main column. He had sent 2 smaller groups ahead in the previous 15 minutes, using the gaps that kept appearing in the fire from above, gaps he still could not explain. Gaps that kept happening at the exact right moment that kept pulling him forward, when logic said the forward direction was impossible. He had been in enough combat to know that luck did not work this precisely. Luck was random. Whatever was happening on those ridge lines was not random. Someone was up there. He did not have time to process that fully. He filed it in the back of his mind in the category of things that mattered enormously but could not be addressed right now, and he kept his attention on the 37 people behind him and the 400 meters of corridor still between them and the northern exit. "Dawson," he said, turning back to check the rear. "What's your count?" Dawson, the 19-year-old who had fired the SMAW 40 minutes ago and had not stopped moving since, looked back along the column with the particular focused expression of someone who was running on something stronger than adrenaline, the expression of someone who had decided in one specific moment that they were not going to let today be the day. 35 behind me, Staff Sergeant. 2 more coming up from the south, looks like Kowalski and the dock. Get them in. Close the gap. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Vega turned forward again. The corridor was partially exposed here, the road running through a section where the terrain on both sides dropped away, and there was nothing between you and the ridge lines but open air. It was the worst 100 meters of the entire route. He had been dreading it since he first looked at the map, back when looking at maps was something you did calmly in a briefing room, rather than in the middle of a firefight with people bleeding behind you. He looked up at the ridgeline above. Whoever was up there, he thought, please still be up there. He stepped into the open section and started moving. On the ridge, Elena felt the shift before she fully understood it. She had been running on pure operational focus for nearly an hour. The kind of focus that insulates you from everything that isn't directly relevant to the work that makes the body's signals quieter than they should be, that lets you function at a level that would not be sustainable under any other circumstances. But the body always finds a way to make itself heard eventually. Her hands were not shaking anymore. They had gone past shaking to something steadier and more worrying, the deep muscle stability of exhaustion, the kind that precedes the moment when the muscles simply decide they are done. She recognized it because her father had described it to her once matter-of-factly, the way he described everything. He called it the quiet before the drop, not a metaphor, a physiological reality. The body giving you one last period of function before it stopped cooperating. She had ammunition for approximately 12 more shots across her remaining rounds. She had been working for 59 minutes. She counted the active threats she could still identify. 3 positions on the far ridge showing intermittent fire. One sniper, she had identified him 20 minutes ago, but not yet been able to address him cleanly, a patient, skilled shooter who had been working the column from a difficult angle and had already wounded 2 people in Vega's group, and the slope behind her where the movement had stopped for the past 15 minutes, but which she did not trust for a second, because the absence of sound from that direction was the kind of silence that requires explanation. At 08:07, Vega's column entered the exposed 100 meters. She was already watching it. She had been watching it for the past 6 minutes, knowing it was coming, knowing this was the moment where every remaining threat would try to consolidate on the most exposed position of the movement. It was basic tactical logic. It was what she would have done. The sniper on the far ridge moved. She saw it, not the person, but the effect. A shift in the pattern, a change in the sight lines. He was repositioning for the open section, getting the clean angle he had been working toward for 20 minutes, and he was good enough that she had only a partial acquisition window before he settled and started working. She had 2 seconds. She took them. The shot was not the hardest she had taken today. The hardest had been the angled mortar position early in the engagement, the one that required threading a gap in the overhead cover. This one was difficult in a different way, not technically, but psychologically, because she knew exactly what happened if she missed. She knew the name of the column of people walking through that openest section. She did not know most of their names individually, but she knew what they were. She knew what they had been through for the past hour. She knew what a miss meant. She did not miss. The sniper on the far ridge did not take his shot. Below Vega's column moved through the exposed section with the low, fast, focused movement of people who understood they were exposed and had decided to be exposed for as short a time as possible. 43 seconds. She watched every one of them. At 089, the last element of Vega's column cleared the exposed section. She exhaled for the first time in 43 seconds. Her throat was dry in a way that had moved past discomfort into something more serious. The sun was doing what the desert sun does, and she had been lying in it for nearly 2 hours without water moving, when she had to move burning reserves she did not have. She noticed it in an operational sense. The way you notice a warning light on an instrument panel, acknowledge it, file it, and keep flying. She swept the scope to the far ridge. At 0812, the radio on the battalion frequency spoke again. Captain Oak, still coordinating, still running the ground picture from the valley floor where he had been for the entire engagement. His voice had changed from the first call she had heard 30 minutes ago. The desperate edge was still there, but underneath it now was something else. The cadence of a man who was beginning to understand that his situation, while still critical, was not the situation it had been 60 minutes ago. Things were changing. He did not know why, but he could feel it. All elements, we have movement through the North Quarter. Consolidate on the exit point. Air support ETA, 22 minutes. 22 minutes, people. We need to hold for 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Elena did the math without meaning to. Her remaining rounds, her remaining physical capacity, the remaining active threats on the ridgelines. The math was not comfortable. She made it work anyway. That was the only available option. At 0815, the situation on the slope behind her changed. She had been right not to trust the silence. The 4 or 5 figures she had estimated were now supplemented. She could hear it clearly. More footfalls, more weight, a coordinated approach that was no longer trying for silence, because they had apparently decided that speed mattered more. They were committing, coming up with enough numbers that individual engagements on the slope would not stop them. She made a decision in approximately 1 second. She could not fight the slope and maintain coverage of the basin simultaneously. The physical positions required were incompatible. She had known this moment was possible when she chose to stay 3 hours ago, had known it was the price of the choice she had made. She had accepted it then in the abstract. Now it was arriving in the concrete. She chose the basin. She turned back to the scope, found the most dangerous remaining far ridge position, a 2-person team that had been trying to get an angle on the exit point for the past 10 minutes, and she addressed it. Then she found the next one. The sound on the slope was closer now. 40 meters maybe, moving fast, not trying to be quiet, the approach of people who believed they had the numbers and the time. She found the last confirmed active position on the far ridge. She worked. The shot landed at 0819. The position fell silent. She turned. The first figure crested the ridge shelf below her at 28 meters. What happened in the next 90 seconds was the most physically and psychologically demanding period of the entire engagement. Not because the tactical situation was more complex than what she had been managing for the past hour. The variables were actually fewer. The distances shorter, the problem more immediate and therefore more readable. It was demanding because of what it required her to accept. She was not a sniper on a ridge covering a valley anymore. She was a person fighting for her own life at close range, which is a different thing entirely. A thing that bypasses all the training and professionalism and calculated focus and goes directly to the oldest, most fundamental part of the human mind. She did not freeze. She had never frozen in her life, and she did not start now. But when it was over, when the immediate threat on the slope had been addressed, when she had checked in every direction and confirmed that the next closest approach was still 40 seconds away, she sat against the rock behind her position, and she breathed for the first time in 90 seconds, and she noticed that her hands were shaking again, and she was grateful for it because shaking meant the body still had something to shake with. 0824. She pulled herself back to the scope. In the valley, something had happened. The exit point, the northern end of the corridor where the basin opened into the wider terrain that led back toward the base, was receiving people. Vega's column had reached it. She could see the organized movement there, the elements of Dawson's rear group closing up the consolidation of survivors into a defensible position that was finally pushed genuinely outside the worst of the kill zone. Her throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with dehydration. They were out. Not all of them. There were still elements in the valley, still people working their way north, still a rear section that had been cut off earlier and was moving through a different route. But the main body, the largest single group, the 4+100 that Vega had been pushing for the past hour, were clearing the basin. On the far ridge, the remaining scattered fighters were no longer coordinating. They were making individual decisions, some pushing harder, some pulling back, some apparently trying to exfiltrate their own positions, now that the clean tactical victory they had planned had become something else entirely. The ambush had lost its shape. It had lost its command structure, its crew-served weapons, its coordinated fire discipline. What remained was dangerous the way a wounded animal is dangerous unpredictably, without plan, but real. She kept working. At 0831, Captain Oakes' voice on the radio changed again. All elements, air support is 12 minutes out. I say again, 12 minutes. We need accountability on all personnel at the exit point. Vega, do you copy? Vega's voice came back. She heard it clearly enough from the valley below. He was at the exit point now, close enough that his radio transmission was audible from her position, even without her own radio. His voice was rough, tired in a way that went deeper than physical. But it was steady, completely uncompromisingly steady. Copy, Captain. I have eyes on approximately 380 at the exit, still tracking rear elements. We are not leaving without a full count. A pause. Then Oakes understood. Hold position. What's your status? Another pause. Vega's answer came back different from the professional, clipped radio language of everything before it. Not unprofessional, but human. Genuinely human. Captain, someone on that ridge kept us alive for the past hour. I don't know who, I don't know how, but the guns kept going quiet exactly when we needed them to. I want that person found before we leave this basin. That's my status. Silence on the frequency for 3 seconds. Then Oakes, copy that, Vega. We'll figure it out. Elena heard every word of that exchange. She lay still for a moment with it, not allowing herself to feel it fully. Not yet, that was for later, that was for whatever later turned out to be, but not preventing it from reaching her entirely either. She let it land the way it landed, which was somewhere between relief and grief. The complicated emotional space that exists when something that cost enormous amounts turns out to have been worth what it cost. Then she turned back to the scope. The rear elements, there were still Marines in the valley who had not reached the exit. She could see 2 separate groups, one moving north along the east side of the road, another that had been cut off earlier and was working through rougher terrain to the west of the main road. Both groups were still taking intermittent fire from the scattered remaining fighters on the far ridge. She found the position that had the cleanest angle on the west group, the one that would do the most damage in the least time if she let it keep working. She exhaled. She worked. Then the next one. At 0839, the first helicopter gunships arrived. They came in from the south, two of them, the sound of them building from a low thrum to a full rotor wash that she felt in her chest from the ridge. They were 12 minutes earlier than the ETA Oaks had given, which meant someone in the support chain had pushed hard on the timeline, had understood that 12 minutes was 12 minutes too many and had done something about it. She did not know who that person was. She would never know. Some acts of urgency are anonymous in the same way that some acts of courage are anonymous, done in the back offices of command chains where no one is watching and no record is kept. The gunships came in fast and low over the far ridge, and the effect was immediate. The remaining scattered fighters who had been holding positions on the ridgeline made the only rational calculation available to them and began exfiltrating. Not because they were beaten, there were still enough of them to do damage if they chose to push, but because a gunship changes the math in a way that individual rifle fire cannot. It changes the math of exposure, of survival, of what a position that seemed defensible 30 seconds ago suddenly costs to maintain. The ambush dissolved, not dramatically, not all at once. It dissolved the way things dissolve when the structure holding them together has been systematically removed over the course of 93 minutes. Gradually, irreversibly, without a single moment you could point to and say that was when it ended, because it had been ending since the first shot Elena Cruz fired from this ridge at 0706 seconds. She lowered the rifle. She lay still. In her chest, something that had been wound to its absolute limit for the past 93 minutes began very slowly to release. Not all at once, not safely or cleanly. Just the first degree of release, the first acknowledgement that the thing she had been holding with everything she had was no longer requiring everything she had to hold it. Her hands were shaking steadily now. She let them. Below in the basin and at the exit point, the count was happening. The awful necessary counting that follows every engagement, the accounting of who was here and who was no longer here, the mathematics of survival expressed in the most human terms possible. She could hear the voices carrying the count north, relaying it up the chain, and she could hear in those voices the same complicated mixture she felt in her own chest. Relief, grief, the specific exhaustion of people who have been through something that changes the before from the after permanently and irrevocably. Vega's voice again clear and carrying, 396 at the exit, still tracking, I want everyone accounted for. 396, she held that number. Of the 480 who had entered the basin, she did not yet know the final accounting. She knew there had been casualties in the opening minutes before she had been able to address the first positions. She knew the mortar had done work before she silenced it. She knew the machine gun on the North Ridge had wounded people before she moved to address it. She carried each of those moments with her and would carry them for the rest of her life. Not as guilt, she had done everything that was possible to do, but as weight, the permanent weight of knowing what the cost had been. What she also knew was this: she had been right. Every position she had identified from 22 days of data had been exactly where she said it would be. Every transmission pattern had mapped precisely to the stage positions she had predicted. The intelligence assessment that had dismissed her had been wrong in every particular. She had been right. And 480 Marines had walked into the basin anyway, and the majority of them were going to walk out. She pulled herself to a sitting position against the rock. The desert sun was fully overhead now, the heat serious and unrelenting. She was profoundly dehydrated. Her left arm had a cut on it from the slope engagement that she had not attended to, and that was making its presence known with increasing insistence. Her whole body felt like a machine that had been run past its maintenance intervals, still functioning, but aware that it was doing so on borrowed time. She looked at the rifle in her hands, the rifle she had stolen from an armory, the rifle she had carried 11 kilometers through the dark desert, the rifle that had fired by her count 31 rounds in 93 minutes across 1,000 meters of mountain terrain, the rifle that had no official reason to be in her hands. She thought about that. She thought about what was waiting for her back at the base, the administrative hold, the questions, the violations she had committed and could not uncommit, and had always known she could not uncommit. She had made peace with those consequences before she left the wire. That peace was still intact. She had made a choice. The choice had a pating. She had always been willing to pay it. What she had not been prepared for, what she sat with now in the quiet of the post-battle ridge, with the helicopter rotors still working in the distance and the voices still carrying from the valley below, was the feeling of it, not the pride, She did not feel pride, not yet, maybe not for a long time. What she felt was something simpler and stranger than pride. She felt her father, not literally. She was not someone who dealt in those kinds of comforts, but she felt the truth of what he had given her. Not just the skills, not just the training, not just the specific knowledge of how to lie still and breathe and let the trigger be the last thing that happens. She felt the truth of the thing he had told her at the kitchen table when she was 12 years old. The only wrong answer is to walk away when you know what you know. She had not walked away. At 09:02, she heard voices on the slope below her position. Not enemy voices. The cadence was wrong for that too loud, too direct moving with the purposeful sound of a search rather than an approach. Marines coming up the ridge, looking for whoever had been on it. She sat against the rock with the rifle across her knees, and she waited for them to find her. She did not hide. She did not run. She did not reach for a justification or a story or a way to make what she had done fit neatly into any category that would make it easier for the people who were about to arrive on this ridge to understand. She had stolen a rifle. She had disobeyed orders. She had left her post and operated off-grid in an active combat zone without authorization. She had also saved most of 480 lives. Both of those things were true. Both of them were going to have to be dealt with. The first Marine crested the ridge at 09:06. He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the spent casings on the ground around her position. He looked back at her. He was young, maybe 20. He had the particular look of someone who has been in a valley for the past hour and a half trying to survive something that should have killed him and has just been sent up a ridge to find out why he survived it and has arrived at the answer and is not entirely sure what to do with it. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Are you the one," he said, "on the ridge, this whole time? Was that you?" Elena looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. The young Marine stood on that ridge for a long moment without speaking. His name was Private First Class Aaron Tully, and he had entered the basin that morning as part of the third vehicle in the convoy, a vehicle that had been 30 feet behind the lead truck when the first RPG hit. He had spent the next 93 minutes doing things he would not be able to fully describe to anyone who had not been there, things that compressed years of training and fear and refusal into a single continuous act of survival. He had watched men he knew go down. He had kept moving because Vega told him to keep moving and because stopping felt more dangerous than anything in front of him. He was 20 years old. He looked at Elena Cruz sitting against the rock with the rifle across her knees and the spent casings around her and the cut on her arm that had soaked through the sleeve of her uniform, and something moved across his face that was not a single identifiable emotion, but a whole layered collection of them arriving simultaneously. "I need to call this in," he said finally. His voice was not steady. He was not trying to make it steady. "Staff Sergeant Vega sent me up to find we didn't know if there was a person or—" He stopped, started again. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Elena said. "Make your call." He keyed his radio with hands that were not entirely under control. "Staff Sergeant, this is Tully. I found someone on the ridge." A pause. "It's a Marine, a woman. She's got a sniper rifle and I don't know, Staff Sergeant. You need to come up here." The radio crackled. Then Vega's voice, and even through the static in the distance, she could hear what was in it. Not surprise. Something past surprise. Something that had been building for 93 minutes and had just found its first solid object to land on. "I'm coming up," he said. Elena set the rifle carefully on the ground beside her and pulled her knees up slightly and sat with her hands resting on them, not trying to look like anything other than what she was. A person who had been on a ridge for 6 hours. A person who had done something enormous and was now waiting for the world to decide what to do with her. Tully sat down on a rock across from her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, and she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated anything he could have said. At 09:14, she heard multiple sets of boots on the slope. Vega came over the ridge edge first. He was exactly what she had watched through the scope for 93 minutes, medium height, built for endurance rather than eyes moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been moving under pressure for the past 2 hours and had not yet allowed his body to admit how much that cost. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. His face had the particular combination of dust and dried sweat and something harder to name that marked everyone who had come out of the valley that morning. He stopped when he saw her. He stood completely still for a count of 3. Then he crossed the distance between them and crouched down in front of her, and he looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to see clearly for a long time and are finally seeing without obstruction. "Cruz," he said, not a question. He recognized her. Of course he recognized her. He had sat 8 feet from her in a briefing room less than 24 hours ago. "Staff Sergeant," she said. He looked at the rifle, at the spent casings, at the field position she had set up with the precision of someone who had been trained for exactly this. He looked at the cut on her arm. He looked at her face, and whatever he was reading there, he read it fully and completely before he spoke again. "How long have you been up here?" "Since 0400 roughly." He was quiet for a moment. "Then how many shots?" 31. He closed his eyes, opened them. "The machine gun on the North Ridge, the mortar crew, the RPG teams." "Yes." "That was you?" "Yes." He stood up slowly. He turned away from her for a moment, facing out toward the basin below them, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the weight of a man processing something that did not process easily. He had been in that valley. He had felt those guns go silent. He had moved 400 people through corridors that kept opening at the exact right moments. And some part of him had known it was not luck, but had not allowed himself to finish the thought because finishing it would have meant accepting something too large to accept while you were still in the middle of needing to survive. He turned back. "You warned us," he said, "yesterday, in the briefing." "Yes." "And nobody listened." It was not a question. It was the statement of a man who had been in that room, who had heard what was said and had not said anything himself, and who was now standing on a ridge looking at the person he had failed and trying to find the right words for what that meant. There were no right words. They both knew it. "I should have backed you up," he said. His voice was completely level, not performative, not the careful language of someone managing liability. Just a man saying a true thing directly. "I heard your data, I understood what you were presenting, and I didn't say a word." Elena looked at him for a moment. "You're saying something now," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, heavier than relief. The specific weight of a person who has been handed a partial forgiveness they're not sure they deserve. "Get her some water," he said to Tully without turning around. Then to Elena, "Medevac is at the extraction point. You need that arm looked at." She nodded once. She picked up the rifle. Vega watched her pick it up, and he did not say anything about the rifle. That came later. Right now on this ridge in the 20 minutes after the end of the battle, none of that was the thing that mattered. What mattered was getting her off the ridge. They brought her down. The extraction point was organized chaos in the way that military logistics always is after a significant engagement, efficient underneath the surface noise, purposeful, professional, but loud and crowded and loaded with the human aftermath of 2 hours of combat. Medical personnel move through the assembled survivors with the focused intensity of people who have more work than time. Helicopters were landing and departing in a rhythm that spoke to the scale of what the battalion was managing. When Elena Cruz walked into the extraction point with Vega beside her, the first thing that happened was that people stopped. Not everyone, not all at once, but in a spreading radius from the point where she entered. Men who had been in the valley looked up and looked at her and did the same thing Tully had done on the ridge. That recognition, that recalibration, that complicated multi-layered moment of understanding arriving all at once. Word had already moved down from the ridge ahead of her. In military units, news moves faster than personnel. By the time she reached the extraction point, most of the survivors already knew that someone had been on the North Ridge. Most of them were looking for the person to match to the story. She was not a dramatic figure at that moment. She was a small woman with a cut on her arm and 6 hours of desert sun on her face and a stolen rifle she was still carrying because nobody had told her to put it down yet. She was dehydrated and exhausted in a way that had gone past the point of feeling like anything and had become simply her current physical state. The man who stepped forward first was Dawson. He was still carrying the marks of the morning uniform, torn face, still showing the particular rawness of someone who had been through fire and not yet had time to understand that they were through it. He walked up to her directly and stopped 2 feet away and looked at her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "I fired that SMAW, the heavy gun on the south end. I saw it go up." "I saw it too," she said. "That was a good shot." His jaw worked for a second. "I was scared out of my mind." "So was I," she said. "That doesn't change whether the shot lands." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back and he did something she had not expected and would not forget for the rest of her life. He came to attention. Clean, sharp, formal, the full military bearing of a Marine, rendering a salute to a superior who has done something that cannot be adequately expressed in any other way. Two men beside him did the same, then three more. She stood there and received it and did not allow herself to come apart, because coming apart was also for later, and later kept accumulating things to feel. At 09:51, Captain Oakes arrived. She had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it since the moment Tully called it in. She had been composing herself for it during the walk down the ridge, the walk through the extraction point, the moment with Dawson. She was ready. Oakes was not what she expected. She had expected the version of him from the briefing room. The crisp authority, the certain voice, the man who had said, "Return to your post," with the finality of someone who did not revisit decisions. That version was still there. The bearing was still there. But underneath it, in the quality of his eyes when he looked at her, was something she had not seen in the briefing room. He had been in the valley. He had heard the guns going silent. He had heard Vega's call on the radio. He had looked at the ridgeline during the engagement and understood in some visceral, unprocessable way that something was happening up there that was keeping his people alive. He had arrived at this moment having had 90 minutes to carry the full weight of what his intelligence assessment had cost, what his dismissal in that briefing room had nearly produced. What would have happened in this valley if one communications sergeant had not walked off the base at 0400 with a stolen rifle and done what she did? He stopped in front of her. He looked at the rifle, at her arm, at her face. "Sergeant Cruz," he said. "Sir." A pause that contained more than most conversations. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "Yes, sir." "You stole a weapon from the armory." "Yes, sir." "You left your assigned post and operated in a combat zone without authorization." "Yes, sir." He held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through something, not performing the working through, actually doing it, actually making the calculation in real time, with the full weight of everything the morning had produced on both sides of the scale. "You were right," he said. The words came out in the voice of a man who does not say them easily and is saying them anyway because not saying them is no longer an option. "Your intelligence assessment was correct. The positions were exactly where you said they were." "Yes, sir." "And my assessment was wrong." He said it without qualifier, without the softening language that rank and ego often insert between a commander and the admission of a serious mistake. He said it the way a man says something true when he has decided that truth matters more than comfort. Elena did not say anything. Oakes looked at the rifle one more time, then he looked at her. "You are under administrative hold pending review," he said. "That is not optional, and it is not negotiable. What you did violated regulations that exist for legitimate reasons." He paused. "And what you did saved the majority of this battalion." Another pause. "Both of those things are true, and both of them will be part of what happens next." It was the most honest thing he had said to her since she had first heard his voice. "Understood, sir," she said. He nodded once. Then he turned and spoke to the medical officer beside him, directing attention to her arm, to her hydration state, to the formal processing that needed to happen. He moved with the deliberate purposefulness of a man who is taking responsibility for the management of a situation rather than distancing himself from it. She let the medic take her arm. The administrative hold was immediate and formal. By the time the medical team had addressed the cut and gotten IV fluids into her and established that she was stable, the official language had already been drafted. Unauthorized weapon use, disobedience of direct orders, abandonment of assigned post, unsanctioned combat operation. The violations were real. They were documented. They were exactly what she had known they would be when she made the decision to leave the wire at 0400. She signed the acknowledgement without reading it because she had already read it in her mind a dozen times. What she had not read in her mind, what she had not allowed herself to predict, because predicting it felt too much like hoping for it, and hoping for things in combat felt dangerous, was what happened over the following 48 hours. The survivor testimonies began arriving at 1500 that afternoon. Vega's came first. It was 3 pages single-spaced, formatted in the precise military language of an official statement, and it contained a level of specific detail that told anyone reading it that the man who wrote it had been thinking about it since the moment he came off the ridge. He documented the timing of every gun going silent. He documented the specific moments when fire that should have killed people had been interrupted. He documented the movement of the column through the North Corridor and the exact sequence of suppressions that had made that movement possible. He concluded with a single sentence that the reviewing officers would later describe in the dry language of military administration as unambiguous in its assessment. Without the intervention of Sergeant Cruz, the convoy would not have survived the engagement. By 1714 more statements had been filed. Dawson filed his. Tully filed his. 24 other Marines filed theirs over the following 24 hours, each one contributing a piece of the picture: a gun that went silent at a specific time, a corridor that opened at a specific moment, the sound of shots from a ridge they could not see, the sense throughout the engagement that something was protecting them from above without any understanding of what that something was. Elena was in the medical tent when the statements started arriving. She did not know about them at first. She was on IV fluids, her arm properly treated, lying on a cot in the particular exhausted stillness of a body that has finally been given permission to stop. She was not sleeping. She was not thinking exactly. She was in the quiet that exists on the other side of extreme effort, the place where the mind goes when it has been running at maximum for too long and has finally been allowed to slow. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about what she would say to him when she talked to him next, which would be from a base phone with a duty officer probably present, in the awareness of the administrative hold sitting on everything she said. She was thinking about how to explain the unexplainable thing, not the tactical decisions, not the shooting, not the data analysis. Those were all explainable. She was thinking about how to explain the moment at 0400 when she picked up the rifle and walked off the base, the moment when the decision stopped being a decision and became simply the only possible next action. She thought he would understand. She thought he might be the only person in the world who would understand it completely without qualification. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes arrived at 1800. Barnes commanded the battalion above Oaks in the chain. He was older, mid-50s, the kind of officer who had been in enough situations to have developed a very clear internal meter for what mattered and what did not, and whose manner reflected the particular authority of someone who no longer needed to perform authority because they had simply become it. He walked into the medical tent, dismissed the duty officer with a look, pulled a chair to the side of her cot, and sat down. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" "Better than I was, sir." "Good." He looked at her for a moment. "I've been reading statements for the past 2 hours. I've reviewed the engagement timeline. I've spoken with Captain Oaks and Staff Sergeant Vega." He paused. "I've also bulleted your original intelligence report, the one you submitted before the briefing, the one Rourke's office marked as not meeting threshold for route modification." She waited. "Your analysis was correct in every particular," he said. "Every position you identified was confirmed during the engagement. The transmission patterns you mapped correspond exactly to the staging locations we have now documented on the ground." He paused again. "The intelligence failure on our end was significant. That is going to be part of what this investigation addresses." "I understand, sir." Barnes leaned forward slightly in the chair, his elbows on his knees. It was not the posture of a superior officer conducting a formal review. It was the posture of a man having a direct conversation. "You understand what you're facing," he said. "The violations are real. I'm not going to pretend they aren't or that they don't carry consequences. The regulations you broke exist because unauthorized individual action in combat environments creates risks that can exceed the risks it addresses. That is a legitimate concern." "Yes, sir." "And in this case," he continued, "unauthorized individual action in a combat environment saved approximately 400 lives and prevented what would have been the largest single engagement casualty event this battalion has experienced." He held her gaze. "Both of those things are simultaneously true, and the way forward has to account for both." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she had not said to anyone else, the thing she had been carrying since before she left the wire. "Sir, I want you to know that I understood the consequences when I made the decision. I wasn't acting on impulse. I considered everything. I considered the violations, the risks, the possibility that I was wrong about the ambush. I considered all of it. She paused. And the only thing I couldn't consider was doing nothing. Barnes looked at her for a long time. Your father was a Marine sniper, he said. It was not a question. He had done his reading. Yes, sir. He taught you. Everything I know that mattered today. Barnes nodded slowly. He sat back in the chair. Something in his face had resolved, not softened. Resolved the way a complex equation resolves when the final variable falls into place. The investigation will run its course, he said. I'm not going to tell you the outcome because I don't control all of it. What I can tell you is that I am personally intervening to ensure that the full picture is part of the record. The intelligence failure, the command assessment, the performance on the ridge. He stood up. All of it. He started toward the exit. Then he stopped. He turned back. Sergeant Cruz, he said, I've been in this uniform for 31 years. I've seen a lot of people make hard decisions. I've seen people make the right call and pay for it, and people make the wrong call and never face a consequence for it. He paused. What you did on that ridge, the technical performance, the duration, the conditions, that is not something I will forget. And it will not be forgotten by the people who were in that valley today. He left. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling of the medical tent and let the full weight of the day arrive completely for the first time without managing it or measuring it or holding it at arm's length. She let it come, and it came. In the days that followed, the investigation moved with the particular seriousness of a process that understood it was managing something consequential. The violations were documented in full. Rourke's intelligence assessment was re-examined and found to be critically deficient in its handling of Elena's submitted data. The command decision to dismiss her warning was formally recorded as a contributing factor in the engagement. Vega's statement and the 27 additional survivor testimonies were entered into the formal record and treated with the weight they deserved. Elena cooperated with every part of the process. She answered every question directly and completely. She did not minimize the violations, and she did not minimize the outcome. She told the truth about all of it in the same unflinching way she had told it on the ridge when Tully asked her if she was the one. Yes. On the 6th day after the battle, Vega came to see her. He came during the evening quiet when the base had settled into the lower register of activity that passed for calm in a forward operating environment. He came without a specific purpose, or rather without a stated one. He sat across from her, the way he had crouched on the ridge directly without performance, in the way of a man who had decided that everything from this point forward was going to be said straight. The statements are making a difference, he said. Barnes is pushing hard on the intelligence failure. Oakes put his own name on a letter supporting your performance review. She looked at him. That took something from him. It did, Vega said. He did it anyway. He paused. Some people, when they're wrong about something big, they go smaller. They protect themselves. He went the other direction. She thought about that. And you? He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. I've been in this for 11 years. I've been in rooms where the wrong call was made, and I stayed quiet because that's what you do in those rooms. You follow the chain. You trust the process. He stopped. I heard your data. I knew your numbers were solid, and I looked at the table. Marcus, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. It came out naturally the way a name comes out when the professional distance between two people has been permanently altered by shared experience. What happened in the briefing was 1 minute of one morning. What happened in the valley was everything after. He looked at her steadily. I'm going to make sure the statements are clear, he said. Every one of them. I'm going to make sure nobody buries what happened on that ridge. I know, she said. He nodded once. Then after a pause, your father taught you right. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been holding in careful reserve for 6 days. She let it move just slightly, just enough. Yeah, she said. He did. The formal outcome of the investigation arrived on the 14th day. The violations were acknowledged. The consequences were real restrictions, formal reprimand, the bureaucratic weight of a record that now contained both the infractions and the context in equal, documented measure. It was not an exoneration. Elena had never expected exoneration. Exoneration would have required the pretense that the regulations she had broken did not exist or did not matter. And she had too much respect for the institution she served to want that kind of outcome. What the investigation produced instead was something more complicated and more honest than exoneration. It produced the full truth. The intelligence failure was formally documented. The dismissal of Elena's warning was entered into the record as a command decision that had directly contributed to the conditions of the engagement. Her performance on the ridge, 31 shots across 93 minutes under combat conditions, including direct threats to her own position from multiple approaching forces, was formally assessed and described in the dry, precise language of military evaluation as decisive battlefield intervention. Vega's statement stood at the center of the record. His final line quoted in every subsequent summary, cited in every review. Without the intervention of Sergeant Cruz, the convoy would not have survived the engagement. 480 Marines had entered Cara Basin. The majority walked out. Because one communications sergeant with 22 days of tamao, a stolen rifle, and her father's voice in her head had looked at what she knew and made the only decision she could live with. The Marine Corps had ignored her warning, and she had saved them anyway. That was the truth. All of it. The violations and the courage and the cost and the outcome together inseparable. The full and unedited record of what Elena Cruz had done on the morning when nobody listened and she acted anyway. That was what she had been. That was what she would always be.